And now we are very excited to bring along our very own here at Creative Live, Mr. John Gringgo. Let's give it up for John. So John Gringgo is a local Seattle photographer, and he as well has taught many a class here on Creative Live, including his Fundamentals of Digital Photography, which is one of the best classes out there for anybody looking to learn digital photography, the fundamentals. We're going to be having that class again, John, in January, which we very much look forward to. But John also does a number of classes on particular cameras. So Susan, I'm looking over at you here.
I had a quote that I just wanted to read from Obby46, who said, "Just wanted to say big thanks to Creative Live, especially John Gringo. You guys have helped me immensely." So got a lot of love from the Creative Live community for you, John.
Nice. We always do, John. So what we're going to do in this next segment is talk about the different scenarios as to what kind of people what kind of cameras are best for the different situations. And I know this is something, John, that you talk a lot about in your classes as well, but we thought we would go through with the two of you in these different segments. So let's start out with portraits. And let's talk about what are the best cameras for portraits. Let's talk about lens choices and why that's important.
Right. So for shooting portraits of people, which was one of the biggest reasons, I worked in a camera shop as well many years ago, and there's two reasons people buy cameras for the most part: babies and vacations. All right. And so if you want to take portraits, there's a lot of different styles of portraits you can take. So you could literally use any lens you want to get a good portrait. But traditionally, if you had to go to one number, and we're talking about the equivalent of focal lengths for a 35mm frame, it's the 85mm lens. Yeah. Basically, if you do or get something in the 85 equivalent or whatever is equivalent to it, you're going to be in a very, very good spot. Now you can kind of start to stretch out from there, and that's going to give you a little bit more versatile options. But if I had to just throw one number at the very quick beginning, that would be it.
Yeah, and that's the long end of a kit zoom if you're using a DSLR or an interchangeable lens camera. Right,
so if you do get one of the 18 to 55 kit zooms on one of the basic cameras, the 55 will do a pretty good job.
Yeah. About 70-something equivalent,
exactly.
Isn't it?
And then once you kind of get used to that, and then you start learning more about cameras, you start learning about depth of field. And a lot of those kit lenses have a maximum aperture of f5.6, which do not allow you to shoot with very shallow depth of field. And a lot of people like shooting portraits where the person's in focus, but the background is blurred out with a nice bokeh of focus.
And I think we've got actually a photograph, Jeff, if you could throw up the picture, the F1, actually, well, not quite that one, the one of the gentleman with the pale white background. Not that one. We have one shot at F1.
While we're finding it, yeah. Bokeh or bokeh? What do you say?
Oh, I think, God, do the Japanese say bokeh?
Well, the real problem is that the internet forums will just totally light up right now.
Bokeh
and
or
I
bokeh?
think the real problem is that when you translate the Japanese language into English, they're using sounds that we don't use. And so it's really hard to do it correctly. I say bokeh, kind of like a bouquet of flowers.
I say the quality of out-of-focus background.
I see.
Because I still say Nikon correctly, by the way.
Okay.
But Nikon when I forget. So don't trust my pronunciation.
Tomato, tomato.
So yeah, this is a good example for those of you not familiar with shallow depth of field. This is something that you don't get on your cell phones, you don't get on small point and shoot cameras. And it's something that portrait photographers very much prize. And so having a lens that has a shallow depth of field, and what does shallow depth of field mean? Well, it depends on sensor size. And so it's a bit of a variable number that has a sliding scale, you might say, to it.
And you don't need, I think the crucial thing here is you don't need to spend a lot of money to get a really good portrait lens. I mean, if you take the crop factor into account, you can get a 50mm f1.8 lens for your DSLR or your interchangeable lens camera. It becomes 75 to 80mm equivalent-ish. It's 1.8, it's very cheap, it's very small, it's very light, beautiful for portraits.
Right, that's what I always hear, is that 85mm is that golden...
85mm on full frame.
Okay,
yeah.
Right.
But, you know.
I tend to like a 135 as well, because I can get even shallower depth of field, I can get a little bit tighter crop on it, but what I found is that it's completely useless in my house. I don't have a big enough house. Yeah. And so if you're shooting indoors in a studio, 135 just puts you way too far back. And so if you go down to the park to shoot photographs, well, the world really opens up. And then you can shoot at 135 and you can shoot at 200. There's really not much reason to go beyond 200.
Unless you're very far away.
Yeah. But you can also come down and shoot 50 millimeters on the wider end for a little bit more of a lifestyle portrait. You're not quite as close, but I also would use a 50 if you want to do, say, a full figure from head to toe.
Okay.
Yeah.
50 works out very nice. There's a number of reasons why these are nice. Partly it's because of the kind of the relationship or the perspective on the face and the way it looks normal. Another reason that's not really taken into account is the working distance between you and your subject. A 50 millimeter lens might put you kind of within that personal bubble where people don't feel comfortable having a camera and a photographer. And an 85 would typically put me, maybe 10 or 12 feet away from somebody, which is a nice, comfortable distance for shooting photographs.
But then with a wider angle lens, you back off and you can get a really great portrait of someone in their environment.
Right, and so that brings into the environmental portrait where you're showing a bit of the world around that particular subject, maybe something they're working on or kids playing around, that sort of environment. So it's not a very complicated range to do portrait.
There's no such thing really as people talk about there being bad lenses for portraits,
Right.
specifically very wide angles.
Right.
There's no such thing as a bad portrait lens. There's many bad portrait photographs, but you use them for different things. I mean,
Right.
you could even use a fisheye. If you're taking a photograph of someone you want to be very dynamic and really, punchy, use a fisheye. Why not?
Just don't put them way in the corner.
Right. It'll distort their face, but it'll give you an amazing.
That's true. If you're going for that.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
true. That's a
Very
good way to
dynamic
look at
face.
it. And I think also the concept that 50, right, is what the eye sees. And so with those environmental portraits, where you're wanting to show something a little bit more real.
Yeah.
Right, and so you're getting in just a little bit wider view on that.
It's a somewhat natural perspective. I mean, for me, 35mm is the format that matches pretty much how I see a scene.
Ah, okay, okay.
But 50mm is the classic one. That's what Cartier-Bresson used. Everyone knows, 35mm for me is kind of like the scene that I'm looking at, just personally.
All right, so let's talk about, again, lenses, flashes, and reflectors for portraits. Let's talk about that.
So I think, I was trying to think of what are some tips that I could give. And, probably one of the worst things you can do if you want to get a good photograph of somebody is stand up against that wall and let me pop up the flash and take a picture. There's a number of problems with that, and I think one thing would just get them away from the wall. But using flash when you wouldn't think that you need it. And so if you're outside on a nice, clear day, that's a great time to pop up the built-in flash, adding in what we call fill flash. You're filling in the shadows with a little bit of light. One of the key things when doing portraits is where you position our subject. And I know John's going to do the whole segment later on, but just, kind of for the family photographer out there, avoid the bright sunlight. Be very careful of standing in the shadows of a tree that's letting sunlight through, that's kind of speckled in there. It's better to find a nice, clean site of a building where you can get fully into the dark shadowed
That's
areas.
really, really important. I mean, I know that every time I speak to people about portraits, they're always like, oh, you've got a lovely day for it. You know, it's a terrible day for it, because actually really bright overhead sun is the worst environment for portraits, because you get big panda eyes,
Right.
everyone looks older than they are, it just looks
Right.
horrible.
Yeah, I used to do in the speckled, under the trees, and then I'd look at them and be like, wow, blown out face, dark
Cloudy
shadows.
days are great.
Which is beautiful about where
For
we live
portraits.
here in Seattle.
Yeah,
Yesterday I
natural
was,
white reflector up there all the time.
That's right. Yesterday I was taking family portraits. It's the holidays of my family, and it was not quite raining, so it was just beautiful.
So if you are out in the really bright sun, that's when you use the flash, as John says, because it evens out those horrible panda eye shadows and everything else.
Very cool. Well, we have a lot of classes here on Creative Live. I will mention about portrait photography, so you can take a minute to check those out in our catalog when you want. But let's talk about your recommended gear, possible gear here for portraits.
Well, for
John.
portrait, obviously you're going to want to get something around an 85 millimeter lens, which is going to rule out the point and shoots with fixed lenses that are especially 35 and 28. They're just not suited for this sort of situation. You can use a point and shoot for it. You will find that the depth of field doesn't give you that shallow depth of field. And so I think most people who really are putting a very high importance on portraits are going to work their way into an interchangeable lens camera of the micro four thirds or the APS-C or a full frame sensor. Chances are you are going to want to have something of a zoom lens for general purpose, because you're going to want to do the lifestyle shot, the wide angle environmental shot. And so just beyond like this 18 to 55 on the XE2, which I think is an awesome setup, by the way, just kind of that one extra bonus lens that really does the portrait nice. And that's going to be that short telephoto, whatever that number happens to be. That's a reasonably fast aperture. That's basically all you need. You can have other stuff, but that's what most people are going to use for portrait most of the time.
Yeah. And I wouldn't count out, even things like smartphones can give you good portraits, but they're environmental portraits. Step back, get a shot of the person in the environment. If you are using a compact camera or a DSLR with just a kit zoom, just zoom in all the way. That's the best chance you're going to get of getting a nice out-of-focus background. Not going to be as nice as an interchangeable lens system with a brighter lens, but it's going to give you a bit of separation, and sometimes that's all you need.
That's a great tip. That's a great tip. Zoom in all the way, even if you have to step back.
The other way is to get really close, but that's not flattering, so you don't want to do that.
Especially for the ladies.
Yes.
All right, cool. Well, that is talking about portraits. Unless you have any final comments on portrait, let's move on to family photography. Again, this is Cyber Monday. There might be a lot of folks out there who have families or have grandkids or cousins, et cetera, and now as the holidays are coming up, gonna be taking pictures of those group shots. Maybe it's your kids, indoors, outdoors. What are some of the key factors that people should be thinking about when they're looking for cameras for family photography?
Well, not having any kids myself, I'm going to have to go off of advice from other
Nieces,
people.
nephews, come on, you're a coach.
Yes, I am. And so I think one of the things is to have a camera that you are comfortable using and carrying around quite a bit. And so I think for a lot of people, it's going to rule out the big, heavy, bulky cameras. Just because, well, great, it takes great pictures, but you're not happy bringing it around. And while it's not a camera I'm a big fan of, I think this is where something like the little Nikon system works quite well. It's extremely lightweight. There's some nice little options, because when you talk about family photography, we're talking portraits, sports, travel, which is kind of just everything. I mean, we're maybe not doing studio photography, but you're going to be shooting a little bit of everything with this. And the Nikon's, at least this particular camera, is extremely good at focusing, and so it can do action as well as a camera of this size can. And so that's kind of one little shout out that I would like to make.
The one thing I would say about that is that one of the environments in which a camera like that will not shine, where a DSLR would, is in low light. So if you are taking low light interior portraits of your kids and family, maybe not so much. A DSLR will still do that better.
Okay.
And so, yeah, speaking about the low light, with the cameras with the interchangeable lenses, they're often going to come, and you'll probably purchase them with a standard kit lens. And that's a great lens for walking around Disneyland, for instance, where you don't know what your shot's going to be. But when you're inside shooting at the family gatherings and so forth, that might be a time to put on that prime lens that lets in more light, whether it's a normal lens or perhaps maybe a slightly wide-angle lens, a 35mm equivalent lens. There's a lot of good options for these pancake flat lenses that let in a lot of light that are just going to make things a lot easier, because with the sensors these days, we can shoot at pretty high ISOs. I feel very comfortable shooting at ISO 1600.
Oh, yeah.
And with the faster lenses that are f2, you're not going to need a flash. And inside your family living room or something like that, the flash has a hard time filling up the whole area, and it doesn't do a good job at lighting the place very evenly. And so I often try to turn the flash off when I'm inside.
Yeah, I do as well, the same thing. And the other thing that a really fast prime lens, a pancake lens, will give you is it'll give your AF system more light to deal with as well. It's not just about the sensor.
Okay.
It typically will mean that your AF will become faster, more positive. Everything just gets easier.
So again, with families, that autofocus and looking for those qualities is pretty important, right?
Autofocus is a big deal. We actually have a picture of my boss Simon's kids where things went a little bit wrong. There you go. That's what will happen if your camera just can't quite keep up. So there's camera shake in there. It's also not really focused very well. There's flare. It's not a great camera for family photography. It's not fast enough. The sensor probably isn't big enough. Its AF system isn't good enough. That's a fail. But if you spend a bit more money and you go to a mirrorless system and you're smart about your lens choices, then you can make a really big difference.
Cool.
Yeah, and I think probably the best tip for people in situations like this, and this is something that all the serious photographers know about, is that when you focus on a camera, you don't just wait for the right moment and then slam down on the shutter release. You need to press halfway down to focus. And so in a situation where your kids are playing in front of the coffee table or something, focus on the edge of the coffee table or about where they are, press down halfway, and then wait for that right moment. And I think that's one of the abilities that photographers have that people don't truly appreciate is the anticipation of the moment, the understanding of, okay, this is going to get good here in a moment, and being completely ready on your part.
And on the other hand, if your kid's moving around a lot or you're in a very dynamic situation, don't be afraid to use continuous shooting. You know, in a DSLR, it's going to make a lot of noise, so maybe not such a great idea, but certainly in a mirrorless camera or a compact, the shutters are almost silent. So you can sit there shooting at 4 or 5 frames a second, capturing all the expressions that you might miss if you just try and get that one shot. So that's 2 different ways of doing it.
And are there different cameras that are better for that?
There are. I mean, you know, there's enormous range of cameras out there. Typically, the mirrorless cameras, mirrorless individual lens cameras, have a mechanical shutter over the sensor, which does make noise. But some of them, like the Nikon One system, and actually like the Panasonic GX1, if we can find it. It's up there.
No,
That's the one. Yeah. Sorry, GX7 rather.
Oh, GX7.
That's the one. It has an electronic shutter, so you know these cameras, if you want them to, can be completely silent. The shutter can be entirely electronic, so they're very discreet.
Yeah.
Quite high frame rates in that mode as well. So really, really good for family portraiture in that regard, and any portraiture really.
So family, again, I have 3 nieces, or 2 nieces and a nephew, and they do a lot of school performances and dance performances. And again, what are the qualities that you're looking for that, not only for the stills, but also for video?
Well, pretty much all the cameras shoot video now, and it's a rare exception for a camera to come out with video. And it depends on how much you're into video, because most of them are going to shoot good enough, what I would consider family video. If you're trying to shoot a small film or a commercial, then that's a whole different realm that we're not going to get into. But I think all of them can shoot better quality video than most of the video cameras out there when it comes to pure image quality.
And certainly smartphones.
Yeah, definitely. It's the controls that you get into when you get into that side of it. And so for family stuff, I'm looking for something that's versatile and lightweight and has a few options. One of the other cameras, we got so many to choose from here.
Give us some of your specifics for family photography.
I do like the Micro Four Thirds system. Okay. I think that the sensor is big enough, definitely for good family photography. The EM5 is a camera that I had for quite a while, and I really fell in love with it. I kind of just bought it to teach a class in it here.
As you do.
I ended up keeping it for a really long time and starting to use it in replacing my full frame camera because there were so many options.
Really?
And the Micro Four Thirds system is so good because it shares a lens mount with Panasonic. And so there's some really nice, like there's a beautiful 45 portrait lens, which can be had for under $400.
Okay.
And also third-party manufacturers will make lenses for the Micro Four Thirds standard as well, so there's other options.
Any other recommendations for the family photographer?
Well, you know, it's going to go against some of our earlier advice, but I still would reach for something like this. I mean, this is 35mm f2 lens. It's bright, it's fast.
And
it's a
the
very
Fuji
quiet
X100S.
camera.
Okay.
Yeah, very good image quality in low light. Not great camera for flash photography, but that's not the point. But that same advice applies not just to this model, but also to the other cameras we were looking at earlier on, like the Ricoh GR. It's very small, it's pocketable. It's a great camera, again, for environmental portraiture of family groups, especially.
Great. Okay, well, now the next scenario I want to talk about is one of my favorite subject matters, and some folks asked about it earlier, but travel photography. A lot of people out there, that's their goal in life, love to travel, but it's always one of those questions is what camera am I going to take with me? It depends on, you know, whether you're going to safari, which we'll talk about in a bit. Exactly. So what are the considerations when you're trying to figure out what camera to bring with you when you travel?
I think for anyone who travels, you really need to decide the style upon which you want to travel. And we have people who've probably backpacked around the world to different places. Sometimes I'm traveling in a car and I literally take trunk loads of camera gear with me. And it's really nice because you can have everything there. And so you have to decide, this is the style in which I want to travel. And this is going to sound a little bit weird, but the best way to find the perfect camera for you is to look at camera bags and find a camera bag that you say, that's the bag I will take with me everywhere. And then figure out what fits inside of it. Because that's what you're going to be happy carrying around.
You don't want the memory of your trip to be neck ache, right? And I've had many holidays like that when you get back and think, I wish I hadn't taken all that gear. I should have taken a smaller bag.
Yeah. Now, when I was working for the TV show that did travel photography, Travels to the Edge, you know, we carried around full frame cameras. We carried, you know, a full set of lenses. Basically, it was the holy trinity of lenses, as we say, you know, the 16 to 35 2.8, the 24 to 70 2.8, and a 70 to 200 2.8. But now as I travel on my own personal reasons, I want to back off on gear size. And I think something with interchangeable lenses, I think 2, maybe 3 lenses is what most people, most kind of serious photographers can cut it down to and be quite happy with. And what are you doing with your photos? If you're shooting professionally for a travel magazine, by all means, go buy your full-frame camera. It's going to be the best thing that you can take out there. But for kind of the average travel photographer, I think the Micro Four Thirds and the APS-C system is what I would look most closely at. Because when the sensor size gets smaller, the camera, the lenses, the entire package gets smaller in size.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say the other end, where that ends, the natural kind of endpoint of that is cameras with much smaller sensors, like conventional compact camera size sensors. And at that point, you can put in incredibly far-reaching zooms that you could never put into a DSLR or interchangeable lens camera with a bigger sensor format. So the FZ200 there, John, just right on the edge, this is a Panasonic, it's loosely termed a super zoom camera in that
Super zoom.
class, super zoom.
Super zoom.
Which traditionally meant 10 times zoom or longer, but these days means whatever you want. I mean, this goes from 24 millimeters to 600 equivalent.
600.
Oh yeah, and they go up to 1200.
But is it good at that?
It is. Now, this is probably the standout for me anyway in this range right now because it has a constant 2.8 aperture.
Oh, at 600.
Yes. So, you know, it's not got an image quality equivalent to the bigger sensor cameras, DSLRs, ILCs. That's understood. But out in good conditions in daylight, the versatility of something like this is incredible. And I would actually recommend something like this even to go with a bigger DSLR kit.
Really?
Maybe for situations or just days in which you don't want to carry the extra gear.
Sure.
Because the framing versatility of something like this is incredible. 24 to 600 millimeters. And it shoots in
With
RAW.
quality.
With decent
and
quality.
Shoots in RAW.
And it shoots in RAW, so you can correct the little annoyances of compact cameras, like chromatic aberrations and vignetting and things like that.
Can I offer a counter opinion?
Yes, you can.
No.
If you gave me a free trip and told me this is what I was going to shoot with, I would pay for the trip so that I could take my own gear. There is nothing
is that?
wrong with this particular camera, but I like a camera that has a little bit more control, and these things drive me nuts. Absolutely nuts. But I can recommend them for some people because it fits their needs. I understand that people different than me have different needs.
You're one of the enlightened ones.
Okay, so if we are talking about the interchangeable lens cameras, you said 2 to 3 lenses that you might consider. 3 sounds like a lot to me.
Yeah.
But what would those be traveling?
Well, okay, for those of you who don't know, Ken and I are leading a trip to Cuba, and I own a Canon system, and that's kind of course, what I would bring. But you know what? I'm really considering taking my new Fuji XE2.
I was shocked when you told me this, John.
Because this is just such a fun little camera for me to use. For quite a while, I just had the 18 to 55 zoom. And one of the things that I've wanted to have for a long, long time was a Leica with a 28, a 50, and a 90. But I just really haven't been able to justify spending $20,000 on that setup. And this setup at around $1,400 offered a reasonable semblance of what that was, and I really liked it. It was a lot of fun to shoot with. And yes, of course it gave me good pictures, but I really enjoyed the process of shooting with a little camera like this.
The viewfinder's great as well.
Yeah, it's one of the best on the market out there, and having to make that change from the SLR viewfinder to the electronic viewfinder is a little, to me, like going from film to digital. There's this whole transition to digital, and I've finally gotten into these cameras because they're good enough. They're not as good as the SLRs. But one of the things that I've found about the electronic viewfinder that I haven't seen a lot of talk about is I had my camera set up so that I'd shoot a picture and I could check it on the back. And I found that tended to be kind of a dumb thing to do with this camera. And the reason is because the preview is digital. You are shooting a digital camera. You don't need to look at to review it. You're seeing it ahead of time. Whereas with a traditional SLR, you're looking at it with your own eyes through a mirror, and you don't really get to see what's this picture going to look like, which is why you need to review it. And so it's a little bit quicker shooting and a little different setup for the electronic viewfinders. And I hope the manufacturers continue to push that technology because that's a very important part of cameras that I think a lot of entry-level photographers don't emphasize is the viewfinder experience.
Yeah, I agree.
That's really cool. I hadn't thought about it that way at all, so thank you. All right, any final possible gear suggestions for travel before we move on?
I would just say look real strongly at the mirrorless cameras.
Okay.
They may or may not be for you, but I think there's a lot of great, that's my best recommendation for travel.
Great.